the brand new League of Legends organization, NRG, owned by a Sacramento Kings owner apparently, signing what was formerly Coast's organization, buying it off them, but not signing the players and making this new roster, has sparked a level of outrage which ties back into a previous incident or scandal, whatever you want to call it, that involved Coast from last year. And this is a topic which I find a little bit confusing, because people's outrage, while I can understand and sympathize with some of the base reasons or emotions behind it, doesn't seem to be well placed or logically thought out. And the reasons behind it don't seem to be very well defined, yet they're calling for like rule changes or something must be done. Yet it seems like the people who are outraged don't necessarily know exactly what they want doing or how it would reasonably implement it across all teams, not just this specific case. So first of all, let's just break down the details of this. It all began last year in 2014 when Coast had gotten relegated from after the spring split of that year. And if you remember, after the relegation, Zion, Spartan, Shifter were superstar acquisitions over to Dignitas, and so Coast essentially had to start again with a lot of its lineup. Nintendo X left. They were put in a position where they had to like build a whole new roster, and so they put together this roster which had a number of players you probably know. They had like Rocks, they had Santorin, they had Golden Glue, they had Wiz Fusion, now known as Apollo, they had Sheep. Later on, they would get Don't Mash Me as like a sub or something, and what happened was they were going through all these pre-season, summer season tournaments. They were trying to qualify, and they were looking at all the different tournaments that were there, and they got themselves a spot into the promotion tournament. And right before this promotion tournament began, they took Rux and Golden Glue, took them out of the lineup, and brought in these two Koreans that they just found, like unknown Koreans that were just from solo queue or something, called Miracle and Ringer. I mean, Ringer's a great name for this particular scenario, but you know, synchronicity and all that. So they brought these in as the solo laners, and there was this huge backlash from the community who were like, what the fuck, like Rux and Golden Glue earned those spots, they got you to that promotion tournament thing, this is so fucked up that this organization would mistreat them that way and throw them away in that way. They didn't get a chance to qualify in this sense. And then what seemed to satisfy and kind of allay the anger of people who were upset at this was that in the promotion tournament they played Evil Geniuses. They lost 0-3 in the best of 5, and so they were out of qualifying from the LCS. Now they weren't actually, because as it turned out, that it ended up being the. Oh no! Wait a second. This was for the spring. No, let me think. Actually, this was after the summer season, because obviously you play during the summer season. So it was at the end of the summer season was when this qualifier took place. So this was for the spring of this year, 2015, and then because of that, technically it turned out there would be an expansion tournament because the league expanded to 10 spots. So they did have a place there, but those Koreans left anyway. So anyway, you can see that that's where the outrage initially started. So now skip forwards this year to almost a similar point in time, and the team's gotten in a position where they've qualified into LCS, and so people are thinking like, oh great. I mean, a number of these players are quite popular they had on their team, like Chris, the former top laner. I think he was the top laner of Curse Academy, right? They have Shrimp, who's like this highly touted jungler. People are like, oh, wait for this guy to get into LCS. He's been hard carrying the team. And then they obviously Don't Mash Me, who's always been a reasonably popular player. He's had a history pre-LCS, and people obviously wanted to see how would he do when he got back into LCS. But the problem is, November 16th, the team officially sells its LCS slot to NRG. Then the new team is announced, and the new team is Impact, former top laner of TIP and SK Telecom, Moon, they had GBM, who's the former mid laner of Jin Air Green Wings, and they had Quan, who actually had briefly been in the Coast team before, and then now they've just added Alltech as their AD carry. So a very good lineup on paper, actually. Potentially a team that has a chance to potentially win LCS and can be very competitive. Much more competitive, as an aside, than the lineup that Coast had that qualified for LCS, you'll note, which would have been in theory a bottom feeder team, or maybe battling to maybe make the bottom of the playoffs. Now the problem here is that I understood why initially there were concerns about, have they actually like fucked up in terms of the residency rules, like who's going to be counted here? According to Esportspedia, the players counted as the NA players there, and Moon, Alltech and Quan for different reasons there. So that seems plausible that might work. But what's strange is, when people got so upset, they always kept emphasizing this aspect, that these players earned this, they got you to that point, and now you're discarding them, and so you're sort of like screwing them over. Now here's the problem. So people are upset that a team qualified to the LCS, or in the past, the thing from 2014 wasn't even LCS. They just qualified to the promotion match to get into LCS. So even just the process, even the progression of how you get towards LCS, people are apparently upset if you get partway through and you're not retained. And yet, what they're upset at is that the organisation attempted to upgrade the players, at least in the minds of the organisation. Now, first and foremost, if that's the case, then where are these fans or commentators or analysts or whoever it is who's commenting on this sort of stuff? When should you be allowed to change players and under what circumstances? If you have an opportunity with a team as an owner to get a better player and you're going to spend your fucking money to do so and upgrade at that position and have a chance for your franchise to do better now, when are you allowed to do that? There's not. I mean, if you're going to make arbitrary rules, you're going to have to set terms for that. Because by the same logic, here's where it gets inconsistent, the outrage. Think of this. If we're using the logic that it's because you earned something, because you did something with your play, and that leads to something that follows afterwards in a linear fashion, you now deserve to be a part of that, because if it wasn't for you, you wouldn't have got to that part, which no one can deny. You wouldn't have gotten to that point. But the question goes like this: what goes beyond that? Because here's an interesting factor that people didn't seem to have noticed. If you go onto Esportspedia and you look up the team, so for Chris and Don't Mash Me is one of the players that people wanted to see in LCS. Their contracts are listed as ending on November 16th. So if that's the case, their contracts had ended. Now, what is the team obliged to sign another contract with these players? That seems ridiculous. What, just because they qualify? No, the contract's ended. We finished paying you. Thanks for your services. You did a great job. Now we've chosen to go a different route. That seems entirely reasonable to me. It's another thing when they're under contract. Okay, so now let's discuss that sort of a scenario. So first and foremost, let's think about this. So since people were upset that they got to a certain point and then the team didn't retain them, let's use the same logic for other parts of the LCS system. So now let's imagine a player who plays for, let's say, Elements, as an example, in Europe. Because famously, they haven't got relegated, but they keep dropping into that slot where you're safe from relegation. You don't make the playoffs, but you're safe from relegation. They've been in that like 7th slot. So if you finish 7th with Elements, by the same logic fans are using now, you helped Elements avoid relegation so that they couldn't get relegated, and as a result, Elements is going to be in the next LCS split. So by the logic of these fans, you should be outraged if that player wants to play for Elements but is not given the same spot again in a similar contract, because by your logic, he earned them that next spot in LCS, therefore he should be allowed to play in the next LCS spot. Now that's ridiculous. I don't know anyone who would argue for that position, and I don't know anyone, if they heard that Elements was going to upgrade that player and get a better player, maybe even a Korean player who's really good, who would be super mad over it. That would seem quite ridiculous to me. Likewise, let's say your team in LCS does go into relegations and you play in the relegation match and you win the relegation match and you're back in LCS. So think of teams that have done this before: Copenhagen Wolves, Gambit over in Europe. Now, some of those players have then been changed out or upgraded. I remember we had Cubon was playing at some point in time for Gambit. He didn't get to play the next split after that. So why don't those players get retained again and have to be re-signed and have to have another place? Why are you allowed to upgrade over those players? I don't know anyone arguing over this. Let's go the other way. Let's say, in terms of success, in the LCS spring split, let's say your team either wins the split or places quite highly, and then the team decides not to use you for the summer split or doesn't retain your services or upgrades over you and just benches you, whatever. In this scenario, with the circuit point system, they might then be able to later qualify for Worlds as a result of some of the circuit points you helped them get. So by the same logic, there should be a similar sort of outrage. It should be like, this is bullshit, this is unfair. Now, this is the problem with this sort of outrage. It's so arbitrary. People are saying it as though it's like some righteous anger that's totally based in, everyone can agree this is fucked up, right? This is totally wrong. Obviously, it's so obvious that we have to change something. It's not obvious. In fact, it seems very arbitrary over who people get outraged over and in what situations. And as far as I can tell, it seems largely the reason why people are outraged is because either they like a player like Don't Mash Me, either they remember that old situation where they felt fucked over by Rux and Golden Glue not getting a chance to qualify for a promotion thing, where admittedly in that scenario they didn't then have an opportunity in theory to go to some of the other teams. They could have actually, but it wouldn't have happened because of how close it was. And thirdly, they wanted to see how like a young guy like Shrimp might do if he got his chance. They'll say, okay, those are all great, but those are your personal feelings over something. They're not really to do with like any sort of legislation that should be put in place or anything moral. They're just, you just don't want that player to be removed. That's it. There's no moral obligation there where they've done something wrong and ethically fucked up by doing so. Likewise, the way you can show how arbitrary this outrage is let's ask how many players does it apply to. So I've given situations there where it applies that people don't actually apply it. So how many players does it apply? Are you allowed to upgrade one player? Okay. So I'm allowed to upgrade one player, am I? Okay. Am I allowed to upgrade two players? Oh, wait a second, but two players was what made the coast problem for. Oh, okay, but can I do two players? Oh, maybe just for this time, one time I can do two players. Well, then is it 3? Is 3 the key number that fucks everything? See what I mean? It's just totally arbitrary. In theory, by that logic, if it's fucked up to do it to 3 players, it's fucked up to do it to 2 players, and it's fucked up to do it to 1 player. There's no reason why having 3 would make it better than 1 in that scenario. I mean, obviously make it worse, but in theory, it should still be equally wrong to remove the 1 player. So by this logic, suddenly, unless your team's in some perfect spot where the last season didn't have much of an impact on anything, you can't remove or add any players suddenly, according to this sort of outrage. Now, here's the problem I see with this situation. Before I get into the sports aspect, because it obviously ties in there, these people who've played in these teams are paid and employed for what they do now, not what's going to happen in the future. That's a way that a fan thinks. They are paid for their performances now, and that is their job. So it's from when they were signed up until now. And when the team decides to get rid of them, that's the end of their employment there. Okay, that's it. You were never obliged to give them something extra. You were never promising them anything extra. There was never any implication that they definitely get something extra because of what they've done now. Even if they did a great job now, thank you for your services, good job, we've decided to go a different direction. If these players, put it this way, aren't in any way somehow now mini owners of the team who now own some sort of equity in the future and the success of the team depending on what they did and they built into it, they're literally, I mean, to use it to kind of get a bit abstract here in terms of just a normal employment scenario, these players are literally wage slaves who are playing now purely for the wage that they receive during each week that they play now during their contract. And according to their contract, they're allowed to be released and removed and not used in the team anymore. And that's all entirely fine within the system we have. And by the way, that's not an LCS system that you want to get mad at. That's the fucking Western employment system, which, by the way, I agree is kind of fucked up. You don't get any sort of equity for your efforts within the system that you work with. But unless you guys want to like have some revolution where we bring along some sort of anarcho-capitalist system, I don't think we're going to fix that overnight using fucking Challenger and League of Legends LCS systems. So I think you might be going down the wrong road there. Now, there's also the factor that if they are released from these teams, if they're such wonderful players who deserve spots and have earned spots and all the rest of that jazz, why don't other teams in LCS fight over them and pick them up perhaps very cheaply if they've been released for free and get those players into their teams? Now, I will admit the Riot system of like anti-poaching and when the contracts become available makes it a lot harder for said players to find spots because other teams are already scouting out who they're going to offer to and maybe making really quick offers so they don't get lost in the transfer window and miss their opportunity. So that does kind of fuck over players, as I've already mentioned in past videos. But even regardless, the reason why a lot of these players won't be picked up is because guess what? Other teams out there also want to have really good teams and they won't like downgrade to get some of these players. Now, admittedly, in the case of someone like Shrimp, maybe it's different and maybe he will wind up on a team. But in the case of some of these other players, these other LCS teams wouldn't want them. Therefore, yes, they earned their spot by qualifying up, but it's not the case that they're particularly LCS caliber players who definitely have to be in LCS. I mean, to give you an example, this happens all the time in football, as in you'll get teams in soccer, as you Americans call it, where they might get promoted from another division and the team they had in that division was good enough to win the division or get very high and get promoted. But once you get to the next level, like the Premiership, for example, your team might now not be good enough to play as, and you're not going to have any chance of making a top part of the league. You're going to be in the bottom part fighting against relegation the whole time. So as a result, if you have the opportunity and the money and the spending, you're going to try and upgrade certain positions, even though that guy got you to this point because he was good enough to play in that one. That's why you paid him for that. You now get someone who's better for the next division. It's logical. It makes perfect sense. Likewise, that is the business of sports. These players, by the way, act in their interests. The teams act in their own interests. Now, the reason I say each is acting in their own interest, because that's another part where the outrage is inconsistent, because no one goes the other way. So let's imagine the same scenario. So think of a team like H2K, this sort of a team. Surely these teams could now argue for someone like Kasing, like, I gave you a platform. I mean, H2K brought in Kasing when he was just some failed guy who'd been on MYM who wasn't particularly impressive there, and no one knew he'd be super good when he got onto H2K, and as good as he was. So they could say the same logic, surely. Oh, well, you have to sign with us next season, Kasing. Why is that? Like, my contract's up. Oh, no, you have to sign with us because we gave you the exposure and the platform. We gave you a starting spot. And as a result of that, you did well, and you even got to go to Worlds and showed off. And that's why you're now getting this chance potentially to play next to it, and also why you're getting these offers. So if you're going to be, to be fair, to not be like fucked up ethically, morally in this world of fans, you should have to re-sign with us because, that would only be the right thing to do, right, Kasing? No one thinks that way. In fact, no one has a problem ever when players leave teams that aren't that good and upgrade to really good teams. Like, or not even necessarily really good teams, but really good orgs, like a TSM, even a CLG, who we know have a lot of money. These big orgs, no one has a problem when players better their interests and take care of their own situation and improve their own scenario, even though it might fuck over the old team that was relying on them and built a team around them. Remember when NIP was building that team around fucking Bjergsen before he went to TSM? They signed Kevin, the top player of SK, who was one of the stars of the league at the time, and they signed Hookbot, who's considered one of the better junglers, for money, an actual contract buyout fee early on in League of Legends at the end of season 3, and yet Bjergsen then just went to TSM, got a better scenario, and in fact did some poaching himself to get the team so it still even worked. They'd already spent money on that. What is everyone going to go, that's fucked up, Bjergsen, that you'd leave that team and go to a better team like TSM and have a chance to go to Worlds? No one said any of that shit. No one had that outrage. The outrage is inconsistent in this scenario, especially when you try and put it into different perspectives. So like you do the thought experiment for different teams. Now, I'll tell you one thing that is inconsistent at all times, and that you really do get what you deserve there. You get what you've earned for your performance, and that's Alpha Draft. So if you want to play fantasy esports, where you could put any of these players on a team if they're an LCS, and that could be your lineup, and you could potentially win money and respect, then go ahead and go to alphadraft.com. If you don't want to, then shut up. Don't be outraged about that. It's just me making Skrilla.